UrbanTalk would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. We recognise and we celebrate our continued connection to country, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Planning Congress podcast. In partnership with the Planning Institute of Australia, UrbanTalk is once again hosting a special podcast series in the lead up to the 2025 National Planning Congress that will take place in Darwin, Garramilla country, between May 28 and 30. Through this podcast, we will bring you interviews with key local and international speakers so that you can get a taste of what to expect at Congress. My name is Belinda Barnett and I am the podcast host. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by Professor Anthony Burke. Anthony has over 25 years' experience celebrating the value of good design and architecture around the world. He's an expert host and presenter, tour leader, architectural writer, and professor of architecture in the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building at the University of Technology, Sydney. A graduate of Columbia University in New York, Anthony is an honorary fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects and recognised internationally for his work in architectural design, curation and commentary. Anthony currently hosts a series of productions for the ABC, including Grand Designs Australia, Restoration Australia, and co-hosts Grand Designs Transformations. He is a host and producer for a new show on the Southeast Asian design cultures titled Culture by Design, which is released on ABC International. Welcome, Anthony.
Hi, Belinda. Great to see you.
Thank you so much for taking the time out of your hectic recording schedule to join us on the podcast today.
My pleasure.
I love Grand Designs Australia and the aspirational journeys that you take us all on. What I particularly love about your shows is that in a world where we have so much mass production and cookie cutter design, the journeys that you take us on and the beautiful outcomes that we get to experience are so personal and unique. And in today's world, that is very special indeed. So thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so glad you enjoy watching.
At Congress, Anthony will be part of the plenary panel session, Planning for the Housing We Need. And today with Anthony, I'm going to talk about housing design and typologies and the challenges that we face trying to deliver the sheer volume of housing that is required to address Australia's housing crisis. Anthony, I've read that you grew up in Sydney's Northern Beaches. You've lived in high-density apartments in both New York and Hong Kong. You've lived in Sweden, and you now live in inner Sydney. These are all very different urban settings and very different housing typologies. For you, what are the constant design qualities that make the perfect home, regardless of location and dwelling type?
Wow, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What's the perfect design quality? What's the constant, yeah? I guess the first thing I say is I don't think there is a perfect, but I think there are things that we need to do consistently to get really great quality in our built environment. And as you say, I've been fortunate enough to live in a few places around the world, and at each moment I was obviously at a very different stage of life. So perfect for me meant different things at different times, like it does for all of us. I mean, I remember a perfect Christmas was with my wife and I when we weren't married at that point, but we were living in New York in a brownstone in Brooklyn. We had one friend come over who was an expat as well, and in this big old sort of parlor level, 1-bedroom place, we cooked everything in the gourmet magazine sort of, Christmas feast. Way too much food as the snow started to fall outside, and it was just amazing. It was one of those days you think this is so special. So I think every stage of life has that perfection. I think with that too, there are some fundamentals that we can build on. I think it is absolutely essential that we all have just a little bit of access to the outdoors and some green space somewhere. Doesn't matter if we're in an apartment, we've got to find some connection to the outdoors and to nature. I personally get very claustrophobic if the windows blinds are drawn, for example. And in the same way, that kind of connection to the way the sun moves around the building, again, fundamental, this isn't rocket science, but those things sort of deeply, they affect your physiology, our proprioception, all of those ways in which we sense the built environment around us are clocked by those very simple things. So any building, any room, any house that does not have those things, you will instantly feel poorly being there, and really look for the exit, I think, which is a shame. I think the other thing too, though, one of the perfect things is that, and this is kind of gets at the housing crisis a little bit in a funny way, is every place you live has to have a personality. And it might take a little bit of time to work out what the personality is. Could be a bit cranky, could be a bit happy, could be a bit old, sad, whatever. But there's a kind of a relationship that you sort of have with those places around you, which I think is important. We make these bonds and we make these connections, and they allow us to feel safe or to feel aspirational, these kinds of things. And they are really important definitions of home, as opposed to house. So I look for those things. I look for those little signs and little telltale things which allow us to make those connections. And sometimes, like I said, it can be quite quick. Other times it might take a little bit of time to kind of learn to live with each other. And that's that great quote, of course, that, we shape architecture and that it shapes us, or we shape the built. So that principle works on an emotional level as well as a physiological one.
I really like that point about, I guess, the connection and having connection to outside and the actual setting of a home. And I think that really rings through when I look at the episodes of Grand Designs and I look at the various homes and the amount of effort that goes to in aligning windows to views and just the selection of the palette of finishes and materials to make sure that is that connection to whether it's a natural environment or the built environment.
Absolutely. That's one of those things actually that I have these little arguments with my producers about. Like, they just want to talk about the house. And I'm like, no, we've got to put it in its context. We've got to give it its frame. We've got to understand why it is like it is. And
yeah, absolutely.
So we find that I'm helping to kind of keep the cameras being pointed back at the landscape or the view.
Yeah, and because that's very much, isn't it? It's part of when you meet the personalities behind each of these projects, the actual land and why they've actually selected the sites they have. It's very much that locational context. I mean, clearly in a bushland setting, with spectacular views like the homes down the Mornington Peninsula or in Tasmania, that's next level again. But even when you're seeing the properties in inner city locations, there are still aspects of those environments that people are craving and wanting to get that connection with what they're actually building.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And I think that's, we're very fortunate because we get these sort of self-selecting innovators who want to be on the show. They put themselves forward, and so they have a story to tell. They're keen to tell it. But as you're saying, a really big part of that is they've responded in a very interesting way to the site they've selected. And we're kind of following that relationship in a way, the influence across, them arriving in this new place and making a home there. So yeah, it's absolutely fundamental.
Planners and architects, we aspire to deliver quality housing, particularly planners, when we're writing statements of environmental effects to go in with development applications. I can't count how many times we would write the statement, the project delivers a high quality design outcome, written many, many times. To you, when it comes to housing, what does the term quality mean?
Well, that's another really good, big question. I think, my first reaction is I think quality is something that you don't see as much as you feel. And when you walk into a space, you can hear it, you can touch it, you can sort of get a whole sense of it. Yes, visually, but not just visually. And we all know if you walk into a really well-built home versus let's say a quickly built home or a less well-built one, you can instantly tell, as soon as you make contact with the building in some way. And I think, again, that's one of those sort of connections that resonates very quickly with us as human beings in this kind of idea of what home can be. So I think quality comes down to care in the making, if I could put it that way, which is, I know that's kind of going to be problematic when we talk about, the housing crisis and getting a lot of houses out there. But I do think that, those projects where you can see the hand of the people who have made it and the time it's taken to make it, whether it's a heritage building or a new build, that is the real definition of quality there. That's something, again, we feel. I think the other thing too is that there's, I always think of architecture as it's a stage for the theatre of our lives. So architecture isn't the main focus. Our lives are the main focus. So a quality environment is one that really makes that quite evident and supports that kind of, I don't want to say lifestyle. I think that's a horrible kind of word, wrong connotations. But it supports the idea of an aspirational life in the way that you imagine it with your family, with your partner, with the people around you. So quality comes in that sense of, okay, we live in the same house. I feel connected to you because the way that the living room and the kitchen works or something like that. And those qualities, I think, are again the kind of things that you live daily and that come through in really good design. The design itself, it's not so sort of strikingly sort of bougie or something. It sort of steps back, but it promotes those sorts of relationships, and they're subtle and they kind of evolve again over time, but they're the things that make the difference.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about quality and that in some ways it's a touchy-feely sort of, like when you walk into a room, you can feel, or you're looking at something that's already built and you're a new build, you can see it is quality or it's not quality, which makes it really difficult, again, with the housing crisis. When we're talking about new housing and we're talking about trying to get communities on board with new types of housing typologies. And as planners and as architects, we write, high quality.
Yes.
But they can't walk outside their door and they can't see it at the moment. So we're selling them a promise of quality.
That's right.
So it is, you know what I mean? It is quite a difficult concept to communicate at times to broader communities and to give them the confidence, I guess, in the design outcomes that are being put forward.
Yeah, I think that's you're so right. I mean, that's one of the things too. It doesn't appear on a spreadsheet. Quality like that, other than a proxy around budget, but really those qualities are something you can kind of log, and to a large degree, you can't really research them in any kind of, I guess, consistent sort of way. So those quality dimensions, I think this is where we're at. We've had the big consultants giving us all of their advice on housing and everything else, and we get our reports from all of those sorts of people. But I think we're realizing that it's just not a numbers game. This is a different story. Our housing in particular, I think that's not necessarily the same with commercial, but certainly in our residential space, that is the dollar signs at the end of it, or just the number crunching that are at the beginning of it. They are not the be all and end all. They are only means to the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I've read the good architecture can add as much as 20% to the value of a home. I think it was one of the former presidents of the Institute of Architects in an interview with Domain that put that figure forward a couple of years ago. Do you think quality design is becoming a privilege?
I think good design should be a right. But I fear you may be correct in saying that it's becoming a privilege. I think there's a couple of reasons behind that. The first thing I'd say, though, is that housing, and I subscribe to the idea that housing is a human right. So I agree with Kevin Bell, the professor from Monash, and he's a lawyer and a human rights advocate, and he's written beautiful books about, actually very well researched books about just how that idea of a house, a roof over our heads, and a home, not a house, a home, actually is a human right. And there are some, again, qualitative dimensions to that statement that are really interesting to explore. So, starting off by saying that, but I do think then design, really good design, should be able to operate at any level of the financial spectrum. Unfortunately, the way it's kind of communicated very often, and in the media and all the rest, is that it becomes a kind of a luxury item, and in that sense, a privilege. And I just think it shouldn't be that way. I think we should be able to work effectively as the disciplines of the built environment, and I include architects, planners, landscape architects, and engineers in all of that. I think we should be able to comfortably work really well, really good design across the spectrum. And, it's as important for us to be thinking about social housing, low-cost housing, and good neighbourhoods, good streetscapes, as it is to be thinking about, the next client that comes along with a $10 million budget plus. And, I think actually, if anything, we've got to be the ones who are finding the arguments to make, that connect the lessons learned in those projects which have budget, to be able to sort of make them applicable in other contexts. So when I think of that, then I'm not really thinking of, is good design, high quality material, or, I want to say sort of fancy materials. I'm thinking it's much more about just very intelligent and thoughtful dealing of space, and again, to stage the lives that we lead. So that should be as applicable in low-cost housing as in any other space, I think.
I agree with you. And and we're certainly seeing through people like Nightingale, very clever design that is really, achieving a very high-quality outcome at under the affordable housing banner. And so, it is possible, but at times it fears me to think that we may, in this rush to deliver housing at the quantum that we need, that we might lose quality.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic triangle, isn't it? Time, quality, and all the rest, and money. And so, in that sense, we will be juggling those things around. But I think there's maybe we'll get to this in a minute, but I kind of feel like there's a different spin on what the problem really is in the housing crisis. And yeah. We'll get there. I'm sure we'll get there. Belinda?
Well, I'm sure. I hope we will. All right, let's talk a little bit about design trends. So, as I said, I love Grand Designs Australia because you let us experience, the aspirations, the best, the heartaches, and we see, at times the compromises that people have to make when they're embarking on their dream project. And they're so fortunate to be in a position to be able to embark on their dream project. Across the shows and just when you're out and about and you do your tours and everything, are you seeing priorities and aspirations change when it comes to home design?
Yes, I am, absolutely. And actually, one of the things that's been so interesting to talk with the production team around are the kinds of houses that are coming across the desk to cast in the show. And we're seeing a very different kind of conversation emerging, not in one sort of big jump or big leap, but in this sort of incremental way. And there are a few bits to that. I think the first one is definitely sustainability is no longer this kind of nice to have, or I can put it on the edge, or it's my second thought. It's for every homeowner that I talk to, and I'm honest about this, that sustainability is pretty much front and center. I can think of 2 out of 70 where it wasn't like the second thing that came out of their mouth. Hi, Anthony, I'm just sustainability. So in that sense, that's great. I mean, look, I guess I've been doing this long enough to know that there was a time not that long ago where we had to keep making the case that sustainable was good and for all the right reasons. We don't have to make that case anymore. What we're trying to do, we're trying to join up the aspiration of the homeowners with the delivery of that sustainability ambition. So it's not the want, it's the connection that happens, and which is very often financial and regulatory more than anything else. So in that sense, that's a big change because we don't have to make those arguments anymore. And that means then people have started to reassess all sorts of things. One of the most interesting things that's starting to happen then is in that sustainability, one of the second tier sort of issues that come from that is this re-engagement with traditional materials. So we were for a while there going down the pathway where very highly manufactured materials were becoming more and more the expedient solution, if I could put it that way. And what I'm seeing now is a reversal of that. So, the obvious ones are things like rammed earth, hempcrete, these really old techniques that people are leaning back towards because they're looking for something very handmade. They don't mind, often them, they don't mind doing the work themselves, which is also good, very low tech. But I think it's more than that. I think there's a kind of a sense of I see it and I smell it and I understand it's good for me. So when I'm walking into my home, that's kind of what I want to be around, compared to something like something with a sort of a resin benchtop or those kinds of things where it's gone through a whole raft of manufacturing processes, which sort of remove it from your I guess the sustainability side and that sense of it. So there's a little bit in there, I think, which are changes which are very genuine, which are coming through. I think the other thing too to note here is the changes after COVID, and to like we had. I mean, COVID happened. We all lived through that, but that kind of moment, I think, we haven't really kind of talked too much about this yet, but I think it was a real moment of change where we moved away from the technical solution. And the pendulum started to swing back to the humanist side of things. So the social conversation, the community conversation, all those things kind of, really quickly became front of mind during COVID. And then we looked around ourselves, stuck in our homes as we were, and we started to think again a little bit about, okay, what is my relationship with my kids? Oh, how often do I see my neighbor? Oh, when is the next time that mum can come over and visit? Can I get her to stay for a few days? So this kind of thinking, changed. And I think we lent back into that, and we are still now leading towards that sort of thing, rather than I kind of want to build a bigger home. I'm going to have the 5 bedrooms, all with the en suites, and my kids have their own sort of semi-detached apartments over there. And I think that kind of thing has sort of gone away. I want to say it's gone away, but at least for the people I'm talking to, and this sort of social dimensions come back in. Now that I think is really interesting because that has no kind of particular solution. That just has 1,000 different ways in which we can sort of enact that idea that's very personal to us. So in that sense, every homeowner that I visit has a different version of that human story that they want to try and latch onto. And I think you can see also in the show, we don't pinch these people to make them cry. So when the tears come, and they often come, particularly at the final interview, it's like, are you happy with what you've done here? Are you proud of what you've achieved? Kind of question. Those tears are very real, and they're one of achievement for the best of reasons, I think. Yeah, I think, and that's very genuine. I think that speaks to a much larger impulse that we all share.
Yeah, it's almost like people, I think, have fallen back in love with their homes. At one stage, building a house for the sake of it being a house, and at times a status symbol. But yeah, I think COVID made us see our homes very differently as spaces that we actually like to be in, and we want to be with family in, and we started using them very, very differently. So yeah, it's
I totally agree.
Interesting observation. The The term McMansion, like it or hate it, is embodied in our Urban Dictionary. And in a recent article in The Guardian, you've said that our houses are too big and that we would benefit by cutting 20% out of most of our new builds. The old saying, a man's home is his castle, seems to be ringing true about floor area. How can we reframe community attitudes and tastes about dwelling size and get people to accept smaller dwellings that are designed smarter?
This is an excellent question. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think
it's a difficult one.
yeah, sure, I'm not the only one. So I think in this context, I would firstly say that it's on architects and planners actually to demonstrate the alternatives. And I think that's the first thing. When I look at the housing environment around us in Australia, the residential housing sort of environment, it's pretty vanilla. It pretty much tends to the middle, and there isn't a great amount of diversity or range in the typologies that we have available to us. And in many ways, we are still imagining a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, carport out the front, bungalow somewhere on a quarter-acre block, and we were given that in the 1950s. So arguably, that's where suburbia started. I mean, we can argue about that, but that's kind of where it sort of started. And that has been so resilient. That cultural idea that's lodged in our cultural imagination is so resistant to change. And I think what we need to do in the built environment disciplines is a part of what we need to do anyway, is to really demonstrate that there are alternatives and to lean into them. That's much harder than it sounds. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. But in that sense, we're the ones who can kind of, yes, we're all creative thinkers, but we're the ones who can kind of drive those projects to a point where we can bring others to them to let them experience that. And I think that's really important. I mean, I think building as usual right now, I sort of say BAU, B-A-U, which is German for home or house, BAU, but building as usual is broken in every dimension, whether it's financial, sustainable, emotional, physical, wellness, health, all of these aspects to the homes that we are currently building by default, they're the problem. They're not the solution, of course. So when we come to the housing, crisis, I honestly don't think it's an issue of supply and demand. I think it's an issue of housing types. And we just don't have the range because we keep putting Australians into this sort of very average middle bracket. Now, what's happened, of course, since the 1950s is we've had all sorts of demographic changes going on in the country. We're much more multicultural. We have all sorts of different family dynamics, single parents, blended families, extended families, et cetera, and none of those particular demographics or life situations are really being responded to independently, if you like, or as a separate thing. So we tend to still just design towards the nuclear family. That's a huge problem, and that's getting us into all sorts of strife, I think. So when we kind of come to McMansions, and I think we can make the intellectual arguments, but that's not the way to win the war here. The way to win the war is to win the hearts of people by showing them an alternative which is not second rate, but which is better for all the right reasons. Yeah, maybe affordability is a good one, but I also think that like having a really beautifully designed small home for, say, a single parent with 2 kids, that just fits their lifestyle, the reality of their world in a very elegant kind of way. That is not out there at the moment, but we can design that. I know we can, and then there are suburbs and neighborhoods that emerge around those ideas. That's the sweet spot. So I kind of feel like it's going to be a long, we've got a little bit of time. This will take time. This isn't going to happen in a second. This is a big cultural program. The way I kind of think about it is I think we're one generation is going to take to change where we're at now to where we need to be. And that's a kind of a 20 years of innovation that we need to lean into. So when I think of that, I think one of the things that we can do, again, in our disciplines, planners and architects, is to find ways to take the risk to do the innovative model that's a little bit outside the normal. Maybe not like way down the other end of the spectrum, but just enough to move the dial one little bit. 20 years of that, we'll have plenty of losses, but we'll have a couple of wins. And that's, I think, the way we need to think, because this is a huge ship that we're trying to turn around in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true. It is going to take a while to change these tastes and attitudes. I mean, I used to live in a suburb called Willoughby, which had a lot of beautiful Federation homes, and it still does have some. But every time I go back there, I'm just so confronted by seeing beautiful Federation homes that have been bowled over, and large project home boxes with no personality and no relationship to the street, just going up in their place. And, unfortunately, with the changes that we have made to regulations, they can go up with, as exempt development without,
Yeah.
just basically
Without a blink.
without a blink. And they just go up, and they are. And so I guess it sort of leads me into my next question about regulation and how much regulation do we need when it comes to housing design. At times, are planners actually clipping the wings of architects to the point where regulation is compromising innovation and removing the opportunity for uniqueness in our built environments? I mean, do planners and regulators need to take a bit of a chill pill and give our design community just a little bit more freedom, at least the freedom to have broader discussions without being tied up in regulation?
It's an excellent question, because it's a really vexed part of this whole pipeline of delivery. I don't actually think we need less regulation, which might surprise you, I think. But the reason I say that is I think there is regulation, when you kind of step back from the letter of the law, is a kind of an agreed social contract about what we feel is appropriate here. And I think a lot of us at that level would probably agree on much the same thing. So at that level, the strategy, I think we can kind of think. So I think regulation at the strategic level is really good. Helps us kind of understand the situation we're kind of working towards, which gives us empathy to design with the people around us and understand that community context. So I don't mind that. I think that's just a very healthy thing. The part where I get worried about regulation is where we enact it and all the tactics of design to deliver on that strategy, if you like, becomes very persnickety. And I tend to think actually it would be much better if we could be much less checkbox about it and much more kind of performance driven about the way that we interpret the aspirations of regulation, which I know is wishy-washy and sounds a bit grey. But I think in that space, that's where planners have an enormous possibility to move the dial around. And so if planners are the ones who are not only coming up with those LEPs, DCPs and SEPs and all the rest, but then, being the gatekeepers in a way to assess projects against those, I think there's a kind of an advocacy role or a way in which planners could actually move into that space and say, you know what, I think in this case, there is something that I will let go. It doesn't exactly meet the standard, but it meets our brief in terms of the regulatory idea behind it. And little by little, innovation, little by little bit change. And especially in the hands of planners who have the design brain, they have the skills and the discipline to know what is good and what is not good in the bigger picture. So their role, I think, in that is to be the foil between the self-interest of the homeowner and the community interest of us all, and find the sweet spot in that. So I think architects are a part of that, but I think planners have an even bigger role to play there. And that's such an opportunity. I kind of get excited about the prospect of that, because I can see things like, say, design review panels, which probably everyone goes, oh my God, design review panels, another step in the process. Do I really have to do this? If we had more planners on the design review panels, and if those panels had the capacity to say, you know what, this doesn't quite meet the FSR requirements, but in this case, we feel like there's a better performance-based outcome here, and we want to support this innovation because we think it's better for the greater good. That is a fantastically powerful mechanism, I think, for our disciplines to do some very good work and to meaningfully engage with this, but it does require us all to step into that space. And there's a bit of a responsibility thing, but that's our job, that's our disciplines, that's our professions, right? So I think we should be up for it. Yeah,
I agree. It's I've brought this up on a couple of our other podcasts that we've done, but I feel that we've taken a lot of the power away, say particularly from local government planners, to be able to use their own foresight and to be able to look at a set of plans and say, you know what, actually that could actually work, and they feel sort of that they've lost their voice. And I think that's a real shame. And, when I worked in local government a long time ago, but, I felt that when I worked in local government, we had much more meaningful conversations with applicants where we were able to discuss design, and that just doesn't happen now. It's sort of like you go into a pre-DA meeting and it's almost like, well, does it comply or doesn't it comply?
exactly. That's black or white, right?
It's black or white, and if it doesn't comply, well, it doesn't comply, we've got to put in a 4.6 variation. And, that's in New South Wales.
And off we go down the rabbit hole.
And off we go down the rabbit hole. Exactly right, and it's, and I think it's a shame, but I absolutely agree with you that that's where we need to go. We need to get more empowerment to the people that are sitting at the tables who are seeing these designs and being able to have really robust conversations at this early stage in the design process.
I think that's where it is, and I think that's something we should not be dismissive of our own design skills or our own advocacy and agency in that space, in the architecture and planning circles. And I do agree. I think we've been kind of excised from the decision-making process in the name of efficiencies, which actually end up producing a second-rate built environment, most of the time. So it's not leading to better outcomes. It's kind of leading to the same outcomes. And that's not innovation. That's not the change we need. We need the change. So we're not going to get it unless those kinds of things happen. But again, the thing that's positive there is, we have some great thinkers and communicators and creative minds in our discipline areas. We've got to get that activated a little more. It's there as a resource to use.
Absolutely. Again, in the Guardian article, you talked about the emotional intelligence of our homes. Can you explain what you mean by this term and how does it influence design outcomes?
The emotional intelligence is, again, it's a little bit back to what we were talking about earlier, like how you feel the quality of a place. The emotional intelligence in design is something, again, you can't put on a spreadsheet. It's very hard to talk about because it involves these abstract ideas like quality and beauty or joy or feel goods, and all this stuff. And that's all, for serious people, that's all wishy-washy, soft stuff. No one talks about that. And yet, when we buy a home or when we think of our home, it is the first and the largest emotional bond that we have apart from our actual family. So it is a kind of an emotional relationship that we have. And we just have no language for talking about this, which I find really interesting because it's so central to the way we think. I always say that if we buy a house, it's firstly an emotional decision, and then we rationalize that emotional decision potentially for the rest of the 30 years of the mortgage. So it takes a while, and you've got to make sure you got the. So I think in that sense, the emotional intelligence of design is to understand that and to find ways to play into that and to design towards that, so that the I'm going to regret saying this, I know already. The feels of the place are, as sympathetic to the homeowners and also allow those bonds to be created very neatly. And that then gives us all those qualities of home that we can't put on a spreadsheet. I don't know if you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We start off with shelter and security and those things, and we end up at self-actualization. Somewhere in the middle there is where we just feel good about the space around us. We start to aspire to other things and, we spend more time with our family and all the rest of it. So those qualities are really what we're aiming for when we talk about home. It's not so much the square meterage. They're all means to an end. And the end is, will I have a better family life? So the emotional intelligence is the ability to design with that in mind. I think one of the things that I really enjoyed reading recently is a few commentators who are coming out with sort of a similar line of thinking around the idea of empathy being the most important design skill you can have. You simply have to be able to empathize with the human on the other side of the design project and make that a very big part of your design process. So that's the opposite of the hero architect. It's the opposite of the big sort of master plan. And that's why it's kind of problematic in our current housing crisis, because everyone wants to kind of move. And all of this sounds like it's actually stop, slow, think, hang on, learn, listen. And I think that's kind of a difficult thing to do, but an essential thing to do. So the emotional intelligence there is that side of design. And look, I think a good architect, if you are a new homeowner going to an architect to talk about a new house, for example, if you're a good architect, you'll throw down the first design response after that initial meeting only as a way to get more information from the client to understand them better, and so you're going to kind of go through this sort of psychological game for a little while to get to the kind of essence of what is really important for you. What do you really need? Rather than what do you think you need or what do you just simply want because you saw it, in a magazine.
Yeah, no, I get that entirely. I mean, with community consultation, it's the same thing. Often clients say, "Well, no, we'll just ask the community what they want." I say, "No, that's an impossible scenario because it's too hard. People don't know. You have to at least put down some options, and then you'll get them engaged in a dialogue. They can start." They can start conceptualizing what you're talking about. So it's interesting.
I think too, the other part of this is, and this is going to sound even more kind of off the cuff a bit, it's sort of, we've got to get people to really emotionally make those connections, but we want people to fall in love with their houses a bit. And that's in sustainability terms. That means you look after it. means you look after your street. It means you'll do the right thing by your neighbour's lawn, So those things have these very real world, tangible, ripples that flow out from that kind of sense. It's not just how good do I feel today. It means I will act in a certain way around my neighbours and my context here, and that's worth going for. But I mean, if it's just about I want to stay in the house longer, so I'm going to look after it, that's a great sustainability kind of win, I think.
I agree. Let's talk a little bit more about the housing crisis and this sort of quality versus quantity sort of argument that can at times gets brought up. So we know we've got the National Housing Accord, and it set a very ambitious target of 1.2 million new well-located homes to be delivered over the next 5 years. We've touched on this already, whether it's time for Australians to abandon the great Australian dream of owning a house with a backyard. How do we get people to reframe this dream and aspiration that they have, when what we really need is to ensure that all Australians, as you said, have a home, have shelter?
I think the 1.2 million homes target is fantastic in many ways. I mean, it is kind of like a great target for us to aim to. It's aspirational, which is good. We need that. I think if we, and I think we can absolutely achieve it, but we can only achieve it if we can broaden the types of homes that we're actually talking about when we say 1.2 million homes. So, like if we're going to, again, build those 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom sort of numbers on the perimeters of the metropolitan centres, we're not going to get to 1.2 million. And actually, do you really want to do it that way? I don't think we do. We've got other ways to think of home. And that's the kind of the project at hand. So I guess, in that sense, helping people to sort of see the alternatives is something that we need to keep finding ways and language for. And it also, I think it requires us as disciplined leaders, I suppose, to advocate. We have a platform. I was saying this at an awards evening the other night, actually. We have a platform. We have, media interest. And actually out there, we have a very informed Australian public. They've been watching Kevin McLeod on Grand Designs for 25 years. So they've got,
exactly.
They've got the vocabulary. They kind of know, there's a kind of a good sense of the edges of the arguments here. So we don't have to kind of school people. That's not the game. I think the game here is to talk to them and invite them into the tent. And in that sense, let them feel like they're part of the solution rather than we'll solve it and we'll just give it to you. You're all good. So that's part of the advocacy, I think. And I think a part of that then gets back to these diversification of housing types. So when I see things like the pattern book, for example, that was created by the government architect, I see a very genuine attempt to try and just paint a picture that's a little bit different, on a number of different levels. I think we can kind of turn that up to 1,000. We need to kind of overclock that thinking. And then what we need to do, and I was talking to someone in relatively senior levels of New South Wales government the other day, a little bit along these lines, is we need to build a few of these. We need to, show the demonstrators. We need to prototype, and we need to let people walk through them and be in them and go, oh yeah, this is actually really good. There's only 2 bedrooms here, but I can have 3 people in here, no problem, or whatever the case might be, and that's where I think all the money that's going into the housing solution issue, we just want to carve off a small part of that towards helping people, allowing people to take the risk to innovate in that space. So, I mean, for a very small price, a very small percentage of that huge sum of money that's going in there, let's just put that into some really great demonstrators of alternative models of housing so people can come along and have a look. I think that's a big thing. I think in that sense, again, if we're going to try and hit the 1.2 million target, we've got to try and then be comfortable with the idea, we're getting down to much smaller homes, but that doesn't mean worse homes, and most of the time it actually is going to be a better fit for most people. Another way around this, and I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, I know, but another way around this is I'm desperately worried about the lost generation, the 25 to 35-year-old first home buyers who just feel completely like, I'm never going to have a home. It's never going to happen for me. So I guess I'm going to go and rent for the rest of my life, and that's that. I kind of feel like that is a target group that we should be having intense conversations with right now and doing some demonstrator projects with them, figure out what that might look like for them, because they are up for change. They don't want what we know. That's right. They're willing to step into that space and be, in a sense, the guinea pigs of experimentation, but also the leaders of innovation in that way. And so I would love to see some projects or some programs come up that would help to foreground those opportunities.
That's a great idea. Absolutely great idea. If we are to deliver or get close to delivering, I guess 1.2 million homes in 5 years, and we talked a little bit around this, do we need to lower design expectations? I mean, or rethink the pursuit of design excellence? I believe in design excellent processes, so don't get me wrong in saying something like this, but I guess it comes down to, and I think this is part of the conversation that you're going to be having at Congress on your planning panel, and it comes down to this whole pursuit of quality and quantity, and where does that balance lie? Can we have it all? I hope we can have it all.
I think we can. I mean, when I say this, I think absolutely we don't want to diminish the design quality. In fact, it's the other way around. It's just that, again, what people tend to think of as design quality equals very expensive kitchen benchtops and butler's pantries and all the rest of it. And we kind of need to, again, have we need to encourage the adoption of different standards of quality in that sense. And when I think of quality, I come back to fundamentals. I think it's less about the finishes. It's more about, does the light come in? Does the place breathe? Is it healthy for me, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think in that sense, when we're thinking about something like low-cost housing, for example, and actually Nightingale is a great example of this, the design quotient there is exceptional. It's fantastic. I mean, every dimension of it has been so well considered. But the management of the price point, the models of the way the community works together, they are all very experimental and they've been done very well. So I think in that sense, it's been designed not just as an object, but as an entire ecology of relationships. And that sort of thinking is actually a really great sweet spot that crosses planning and architecture over really neatly. And it's a space that we do talk about a little bit, but nowhere near enough in my mind. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think that particular space, and I think also adaptive reuse and reusing existing fabric, are two areas where we don't really. Well, we have examples and we have ways to move through those particular kinds of, spaces. But I think they're both the sort of innovation leaders in current design terms. So if something like, adaptive reuse is a really good example because you can't just kind of like go at that willy-nilly. You can't approach an adaptive reuse project in, say, heritage fabric to change a warehouse into a bunch of studios, for example, without sort of delicately taking the paint off, without kind of being careful with the design and then adding whatever you're going to add. So I think that sort of slow down, stop and act carefully kind of thing is good in that sense. And that brings your design quality back to the forefront. Yeah. So I think we need more of that to make the social or the lower cost or the smaller scale houses as beautiful and as, I want to say, as elegantly thoughtful in the way they operate for people as homes as any other house. So more, not less.
Do you think we have a bit of a selling process and to do to some of our development community?
Totally. Yep, I reckon that's it.
In terms of being able to see that it's not all about the quantity, because we've all sat at the table having the height and FSR debate. And the other thing that comes to mind is, should we be labelling housing? Should we be labelling housing, as affordable housing and social housing?
Yeah, it does stigmatise, doesn't it?
It does, because then I've been, a few community consultations when even you've got people saying, well, is it going to have affordable housing? As if it's suddenly, because we've labelled it affordable housing, is it not at the same level as the rest of the housing in the neighbourhood? It's a real concern to me that this labelling of different housing scenarios, and certainly when it comes to social housing, it's like, is the project going to have social housing in it? It's unhealthy.
Yeah, that's a really good point because you immediately find people pigeonholing in the worst ways. So yeah. Opportunity leaves the room at that point, which is a shame. So yeah, maybe we need a new nomenclature to kind of just talk about. I mean, if you said something like, rather than say low cost housing, if you said housing for 25 to 35-year-olds, youth housing. Oh no, that's a bit. No, we're going to do that one. You'd say, energetic youth housing or something like that. So you kind of maybe demographically carve it up rather than the financial carve up, But I think you're right, and that can stop a conversation like that.
Absolutely. The other thing too is I find it's the way, in New South Wales anyway, the way the controls have been drafted, with getting a floor space ratio and a height bonus if you have a certain percentage of affordable housing. Again, it's sort of like, well, I just don't think it sits comfortably.
Yeah. It's kind of a game, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. I'll get my bonus. I'll say it's affordable or low cost. And then 10 years from now, I'll flip it back into market rate and we're all good. And so I'll wear that for this amount of time. And, that's the game I get for the bonus on top. And I kind of think, well, actually, if we're only thinking in 10-year chunks around those kinds of decisions, we're really shortchanging ourselves. These buildings are going to be in the world 40 years plus, and
Absolutely.
neighborhoods, communities grow up around these things. They have impacts in that bigger sense. Actually, you mentioned developers before. I don't want to make them the evil person in the conversation.
No, neither do I.
Yeah, but I'm really looking for that group of developers who want to be the leaders in the change, and have their own ways to do that. I mean, of course, a huge part of this conversation is how do you financially make this work? And it has to. I mean, there's just no way around that. And there will be changes to that. But I do think that we need that intelligence at the developers level to bring to the table. It's part of the solution. But we need people who are prepared to, as I said, not exactly hold tight to that profit line, or can sort of think of the business model actually benefiting from being the leaders in, say, let's call it youth housing, something like that. They're the kind of, the market, they'll follow the market. So if we can convince the market first, they'll come in behind and they'll supply, I think that's kind of the way it goes. But I think they're part of the solution too. They have to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They've absolutely got to be at the table, and they've got very strong advocacy groups. I think in some ways they're leading the conversation a lot more, and planners and architects, I'm not sure whether we're sort of more reacting to it rather than really having that same status of seat at the table.
They're flooding the zone, Belinda, and we're not there. We're kind of reacting, which is not cool.
Yes.
We've got to get on the front foot.
Exactly, Anthony. In April, you launched your latest show on Southeast Asian design cultures, titled Culture by Design, which is on ABC International. And the episodes are beautifully curated, and it's absolutely fabulous. So congratulations. I haven't watched all of it, but the episodes I have watched have really warmed my soul. In Australia, with our urgency to deliver housing, do we risk eroding our heritage and cultural identity?
There is a risk. There's always a risk. But I think in the bigger picture of things, again, it kind of comes back to that post-COVID moment. Heritage is changing, and cultural heritage is being, I think, very positively reframed. It's slow. But I think if we had this conversation 10 years ago, heritage would mean it's completely kind of just restoring the house as it was. It's the Ruskin version. You've got to keep it, John Ruskin, it's got to keep it as it was made, and the lightest touch, let it fall apart, is actually better because that's more ethically and morally sound, according to him. I think the conversation now around heritage has become much more active. And so lived heritage and idea of a living building and a living heritage and a living engagement with those ideas and concepts has taken root and is doing really good work. And it's back in that adaptive reuse kind of space. So if you talk to your heritage consultants these days, as often as not, you're going to get a very, I'm going to put myself out there and say, I think you're going to get a really positive kind of response to anything that will help the building live on, and take on its next chapter, take on its next life. Now, that's not the same as the NIMBYs and YIMBYs kind of argument. And there is a danger of that. Like you said, was it Willoughby? Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah, you're going to drive through those suburbs and you're going to see things disappearing around you. And I think there is that danger. But I don't think every building is worth saving. I think we do have to find the sweet spot, which is that's one problem, I suppose, with sort of general approach to heritage as it's kind of being played out in the media right now, is that, again, it assumes a bit like supply and demand in the housing crisis. It assumes it's kind of like it's either heritage or it's not. And there's a very clean blank line, and one rule will fit all of us in Australia. And I just think, again, if we're smart enough and we're skilled enough to be able to look at case-by-case basis, and I think work with a lot of the fabric that we've got in the best ways for much better outcomes, if I'm honest about it. I want to walk into a house that has some soul, that has some stories that I can add to. And I feel the richness of that. And I think anyone can appreciate the value of that. And again, it doesn't have to be up on a pedestal, big capital A Australian cultural heritage. I think most of the homeowners I speak to on Restoration Australia, for example, I love the fact that they all feel of themselves as stewards and small A Australian histories. It's the post office down in Pambula, or it's the the wool shed over there. It's these little histories, and these all, of course, are the tapestry that make up our big sort of cultural blanket. So history doesn't have to be so grandiose in that sort of sense. It can be kind of a bit more everyday. And I think people are kind of moving back towards that and want that. I genuinely think they do. I mean, there's a part of people which is like, well, I've got to get as much space as I can for my buck, so I'm going to do that route. But I think more and more people are coming back to appreciating that old buildings and keeping them somehow in the matrix is very, very worth it, and we all benefit.
I think there's also been cost comes down to a lot of this. There's been a lot of talk over time about it being cheaper to demolish rather than to renovate, and people sort of catch onto that and think, oh, okay, we'll just bowl it over and we'll build new.
Yeah, too hard, too fussy, Actually, one of the things that I learned during the Culture by Design series, I spoke to some amazing people in Indonesia and India in the first series, and I came back to actually looking at some of the housing types in Indonesia. There were two in particular that I came across, and I'm going to talk about them, I think, at the Congress. But in looking at those traditional types from our neighborhood around here, there's so many fabulous lessons. And so, I think a big part of that show for me is trying to reverse this sort of colonial idea that we go to Indonesia. We don't go to Indonesia. We go to Bali for a holiday. We buy our trinkets and we come home with our batik skirts. I think actually, really there's so much wealth of intelligence and beautiful design that's coming through this kind of cultural conversation that is ongoing for centuries in the world around us that we need to be importing back into Australia. And actually we did that at one point. We were borrowing heavily from Southeast Asia and the Queenslanders and so on. So a lot of influence going through there. We had a big Japan influence moment as well in our architectural heritage anyway. I think there's much more. There are lessons. I say we're looking for new types. We're looking for new models. Well, they're out there. We've just got to go and get them, And I found a few while I was in Indonesia, which I really loved. Yeah, I'm getting more fired up about it rather than anything else. I'm starting to feel optimistic again.
Oh, excellent.
About where we're going.
Oh, you will. You always seem to be optimistic. So you even being more optimistic is really exciting. You've certainly travelled widely. From your travels and your research of cities around the world, when it comes to density, how do you think we can most effectively deliver affordable housing outcomes? We've touched a little bit on this, and I guess it goes to, this medium density versus high density. A lot of the initial controls or new policies and controls that we're seeing being put on the table have been fostering high density. We've just in New South Wales had the low and medium rise SEP announced. But do you have a thought about it? Should we be looking at high density over medium density, or as you said, should it just be increasing the general range of typologies across the field?
Yeah, I feel it's that still. I think we are going to need high rise, and I think high rise done well can be brilliant. I'm thinking of my time in Hong Kong, for example, living there, and we were living in high rise. I was quite young, but living with three other people in a 2-bedroom place in 70 square meters on level 17. And the reason that worked was because, for me, my life there was in the city. I wanted to be out all the time, hoovering up as much of Hong Kong as I could get. So the way I ate, the way I met people, the way I had, I caught up with friends, it was all about being outside. So I think there's definitely a place for that kind of model. But I do think in Australia, again, we seem to have kind of latched onto a very singular type. I mean, I would just say, have a look at what's going on in Singapore. Have a look at what's going on with density conversations in Denmark. And I'm sure everyone is. I mean, we are, but we need to kind of bring those models back here, I think, because you can do high rise well. But again, it implies a sort of a different, it's not an efficiency model. It's just a different type of life that you're supporting there. I guess I'm more or less a sort of a mid-rise advocate. I want to see the sort of the inner suburbs densify a little bit. I love the 3-story kind of, I think I'm just being nostalgic when I say that, but I kind of feel that is a bit of a sweet spot. And I like also the ideas, particularly if I think of something like Castle Craig, for example. One of the nicest things about that place is the shared backyards, the green commons that run between the properties on the back of the property, and the possibilities of those sorts of spaces that are there in our fabric in most communities. If we think a little bit more carefully about where the fences go, or how we share some of those resources, which then opens things up. I realize that's kind of not a very precise answer to your question, but I think there's innovation that can happen there that will suit lots of us. I think that will really work. So
No, I think you have. I think that whole the medium density, as you say, 3-story apartment building it is a sweet spot. It's cheaper to construct, and I think also for people living in those types of apartments, they're not going to be confronting the same level of strata levy and sinking fund that is going to be very financially onerous on them, particularly young people. If you're already mortgaged to the hilt trying to pay off for your apartment, and then you have these monstrous, strata levies being imposed on you over the years, it's a recipe for financial, a lot of financial stress.
It's like holding your head underwater while you're drowning already, like it's just making it worse.
Just lastly, I want to talk about what we can do, what planners can do. As a nation, all levels of government are trying to address the housing crisis. In our communities, we have YIMBYs versus NIMBYs, and we just have too many Australians living rough. What are your thoughts on the role that planners need to play to deliver the housing we urgently need? What can we do as individuals?
So I've got two ideas. But I think just to start off, you said sleeping rough. I just want to say, I think it's disgraceful that we, as a wealthy nation like we are, have 122,000 people, sleeping rough every night or homeless every night, according to the 2021 census. And I just think that is something that we need to fix. And we have 10.5 million homes in Australia, 1 million of which are vacant on any given evening. So 10% of that vacancy could solve that homelessness right now if we changed the way we understood or opened up or created different access routes to that resource. So I just say that because I think that's really important, and we can do that. We just have to. We want to. Why isn't it happening? I don't understand why that isn't happening. I think the two things that we can do as planners and as individuals, one is just innovate the model. I think little by little, the next time you're in a planning meeting, the next time you've got an opportunity to make a decision about letting this thing go or maybe pushing something a little harder in one direction, what's a good outcome, do it. Those thousands of little strokes, little steps make a big difference.
Speak up for it.
Yeah, speak up for it and be the champion of that change, and maybe if that means you've got to go to your boss and advocate for that change or that exception to the planning regulation that you're looking at, okay, do it. It's worth it. It's worth it. And we need it. I think that's really important, that innovation is for everyone. I think too, this isn't just about planners. I mean, I'm really thinking of all of us in the built environment industries here. And the last thing is advocate. We have an amazing platform, as I sort of mentioned before, and we need to be better at speaking from it. And we need to invite people to that platform. So things like this podcast are brilliant, like they start to just get the conversation and the chat out there. And it's not formal and there's a lot of listening going on. I think just people are genuinely interested in these topics, people who are not in the built environment because they live in it. So they're kind of interested, they are vested stakeholders here. They want to be a part of the solution and what happens next. We've got to find a way to invite them into the tent and have a genuine conversation with them. And that's when the advocacy can happen. So look, if I could do anything, I'd say in our uni courses, when we're training planners and we're training architects, get an advocacy course in there, teach our disciplines how to be good advocates for these good outcomes and help to steer the conversation in ways that are very gentle and appropriate, but help to kind of drive better solutions and outcomes.
Fantastic. Great 2 pieces of advice. Thank you, Anthony.
My pleasure.
I'm going to bring the podcast to a close. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm looking forward to going on many more journeys with you through your incredible shows and to learning about the innovations and sustainability outcomes that are being pioneered. I know that delegates will be excited to hear you speak at Congress. So look out for the plenary session on planning for the housing we need, which Anthony will be a part of. Congress is now upon us, so if you're heading to Darwin, make sure to take advantage of all of the fantastic presentations and workshops. To learn more, go to the Congress events page of the PIA website. If you have any questions, please email congress@planning.org.au. Follow the UrbanTalk podcast feed in your app of choice to hear more from this Planning Congress series or our regular podcast, and leave a review to help others find the show. If you're a developer or planner who needs help with community engagement, then get in touch with us at urbantalk.com.au. I'm Belinda Barnett, and thank you for listening to the Planning Congress 2025 podcast.